Here we are in the fifth week of REL 340. We are looking at John chapter 3, verses 1 through 36, although when we see the outline, it actually begins a few verses before that episode. We want to start with the outline, which is fairly basic. John 2, 23 through 321 is broken into three parts. The first part is the transition of chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, which we talked briefly about last time. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. Then the first 13 verses are the interaction between Jesus and Nicodemus. Verses 14 through 21, I identify as the narrator part 1. There's a big question about whether it's Jesus speaking or the narrator speaking. I prefer to see the entire thing as the narrator. That is followed in verses 22 through 24 by a second transition, which then leads us into the last verses, 3, verse 25 through 36, where we now talk about John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer. He makes a final appearance in the text. That then is verses 25 through 30. And then, just as in the previous section, there are some words that are wondering if they spoke about John or the narrator. I prefer to attribute those to the narrator. So verses 31 through 36 is the second narrator part. So when we start looking at the themes that are included in this particular section, one of those is that of signs. We know that the transition highlights that. And so in verse 23, it says, Jesus, people observed his signs which he is doing. So we only have the wedding at Cana prior to this. We don't have a description of any miracles that happened in this section. And so Jesus was doing miracles that are not narrated for us. And then the Pharisee, Nicodemus, came and says, we know that you have come from God because no one can do the signs that you're doing. So there's a direct reference there to the signs that Jesus is performing, which are not narrated to us. And so we can only assume that those are signs such as the healings and other things, maybe some exorcisms, even though they're not reported in the Gospel of John. A second thing that we have is that Nicodemus is of the Pharisees. And we know from the first chapter that it was the Pharisees who sent people out to question John the Baptist. So we see a characterization of Pharisees as those who are questioning those who are teaching about God who may not have the correct pedigree. And so Nicodemus here is sent, or perhaps goes on his own in order to do that. And so their questions about the Messiah is the main focus. The emphasis in the Greek text, as I understand it, is that the emphasis is that he is a teacher. Nicodemus refers to him as a rabbi, and he says, we know you come from God as a teacher. Right? The emphasis is not that he is from God, but that he is a teacher. And the Pharisees were the teachers of the people. They were the ones who had studied Torah, both written and oral. So that's a second emphasis. And then what we find in this section, which we discussed already, is one of the truly sayings. The easiest way to abbreviate them. Sometimes I say, tell you the truth is a paraphrase or a more loose translation of the idea. So we have that in John 1:51. We also have that in 3:3. We also find that several other places in this section. Okay? We have it in 3:5. We have it in 3:11. And then we don't have it in 4:5. And so the truly a kind of characterization that Jesus is doing some speaking in that particular one. These truly sayings are very important. We'll talk about this probably in person. a major theme that gets brought about is the idea of being born again. Now, from a translation standpoint, it's very interesting because Jesus says one must be born, and then he uses an adverb to modify that verbal activity, and then he cannot see the kingdom of God. Now, Nicodemus says, how can man be born when he is old? He cannot enter a second time. So he thinks about a second birth, but Jesus then corrects him and says it is a second type of birth. You have one of the flesh and one of the spirit. And so the idea of being born again is actually misleading because that's what Nicodemus thinks. One is born from above, and so the adverb that's being used to modify the verb birth is a meaning that can be either once again or from above. And it should be taken as he is born from above. And Nicodemus just misunderstood the possible meanings. This is called it's one of the themes of John's Gospel, where he has this double entendre, two meanings of a word. It is a stylistic development, and there are frequent times where we see that, where the word could have two meanings. The audience takes one possible answer, but Jesus is intending the second, and so there's misunderstanding that takes place. And when we talk about birth, there are certain things that we should pay attention to. First, birth is a passive activity. We are born. We do not birth. We are born. And so there's a passive activity. It's not an active verb. So God is the one giving birth, just as our mothers once gave us birth. The important part is one is born by the Spirit. So it's a spiritual element, which is in contrast to the fleshly element. Those two themes become quite controversial. In fact, that when we talk about John being a spiritual gospel, it's because he is comparing it to a fleshly type of gospel. So there is a sense of talking about those things that we see and do, and then talking about those things which simply are. They exist, but they are not always perceptible. And then finally, there is the water and the spirit. And that ties us back into John chapter 1, verse 13. When we go back there to see what he says, this again is at the center. It just follows up on that central point of the chiastic structure, which Alan Culpepper provides to us. And so it's referencing as many as received him, verse 12. To them he gave the right to give children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And then verse 13 says, who were born of God, and then contrast, not of blood, not of the fleshly will, not of a person's will. And so it removes the birth from this natural concept to this divine concept that God births us. The power in which God acts in this world is through the power of the Spirit. And so when we look at that, we see a connection to the prologue in this particular section. Another major theme at this point, though it is not a major theme in John's gospel, is that of kingdom. We have kingdom language here with Nicodemus, verse 5. Jesus says, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. Then we have, again, in verse 7. I'm sorry, wrong verse. Verse 3, right? Unless the born again not see the kingdom of God. And then in verse 5, Jesus says, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. So these are both truly statements tied to the kingdom of God. Kingdom doesn't show up again until chapter 18, when Jesus is having a discussion with Pilate about what kingdom he is from. And so we see how this not chiastic structure here, but the inclusion of these two stories takes place in building what's taking place. One crucial word that we're going to talk about is testimony. We've already discussed the testimony of John the Baptizer. We discussed in the latter part of First John chapter 1, the testimony of Andrew, the testimony of Philip, the testimony of Nathaniel. But here now we have testimony that Jesus gives. Truly, truly, I say to you, it's very important. We speak of what we know and testify of what we have seen, and you do not accept our testimony. So here Jesus is speaking for a larger group that perhaps are being addressed by the Pharisees. Perhaps John the Baptist is in his thinking, perhaps even his disciples who are talking about these things. But we have this testimony. Right? And so the idea of testimony, the idea of believing testimony or not believing testimony are crucial. We have, again, another major thing that's issued is the idea of the Spirit. Now, the word Spirit, the pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, pneuma, pneumatics, as I would say it in English, but there is a P in there, spelling, is the use of air. So a pneumatic tool uses air pressure. The Spirit is also the pneuma. And so that gives us this double entendre. Is it the wind which we hear blowing, or is it the Spirit of God which we sense at work? And that's put together in verse 8. The wind blows where it wishes. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it's going. So everyone who is born of the, and he uses the same word. We can say wind, but here we translate the Spirit because that's the context that he's been discussing. And then another theme, and there's a lot of themes that we have in this particular section, is that of where this Spirit comes from. Where does Jesus come from? That's a very important section. Chapter 1, verse 10. And going back into the prologue, we have the idea that he was in the world was made through him, the world did not know him. He came to his own. Where did he come? Well, that's verse 9. The world with true life coming into the world. Where's it come from? Well, it comes from the early part, right? Well, the word was with God. So that's where he is coming from. We see this again in chapter 8 and then chapter 21 that we find these kinds of discussions. I'm sorry, chapter 8, verse 14, and then verses 21 to 23. So the Spirit is introduced at those points. Where is Jesus from? Is a question that keeps being brought back. And then the idea of ascension and descension. The typical idea is that of Enoch, who was here on earth and ascended. We have Elijah, who is here on earth and ascended. And then there is an anticipation that they will then descend. But here we have one who is with God, who then descends and will later ascend. So which one is of greater authority? The one who ascends and descends, or the one who descends and then ascends? Because where are they from? With that, we're going to go ahead and pause, not knowing quite how long we have been talking, so that this video doesn't pick up too long, and we'll pick up with themes in the last part of John chapter